that are accompanying us today and that are with us at this launch, mainly Costa Rica. I see our President Solano, and I think that Carlos Alvarado will be with us. They're presidents also at the ECLAC, and that is why I'm very pleased to see that they're with us today. And of course, the President of the Republic of Ecuador, Guillermo Lasso, and of course, Ivan Duque, President of the Republic of Colombia. I would also like to greet our route companions, President of the OECD, President of the Center of Development, and as Raga says, we hope to be able to meet soon. And of course, the President of Diaz Granados, Executive President of the Development Bank of Latin America. And the Commissioner of International Partnerships of the European Commission, Jutta Urpilainen, has been extremely helpful throughout. I hope that we will be able to work together for a better recovery. And if I've understood correctly, the challenges have to be faced together as a region, because that's extremely important for us, and also together with our international partners that you are. And our challenge as a region is that this is an unprecedented challenge that requires unprecedented efforts and partnerships that we can establish and that have to be strengthened and become more sustainable. It's an honor for us to be in the presence of the president of countries that have distinguished themselves through actions and so allow me immediately to move on directly to give the floor to our distinguished guests. I don't see Don Carlos Alvarado. I don't know whether the president is here or only the minister. Are you muted? We do not hear you. We do not hear you. Okay, now. Can you hear us? Hello, good morning, Alicia. Greetings to the presidents. Mr. Alvarado is attending to urgent matters and will be joining us in the next 15 minutes. Maybe we could change the order of interventions, and I will be representing him if you allow me to do so. Thank you very much. I think that, Mr. Chancellor, I think that we can give the floor directly to His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Colombia, our friend, Mr. Ivan Duque. Thank you very much. Please, President, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Dear Alicia, a very warm greeting from Barranquilla, and also greetings to our good friend Guillermo Lasso, the President of the Republic of Ecuador, also to Sergio Diaz Granados, who is with us, and to Matthias Cormann, the Secretary General of the OECD, as well as to the Director of the Development Centre of OECD, and Jutta as well. Greetings to the Chancellor of Costa Rica. And what I would like to say, Alicia, in my intervention, is to point out several things. First of all, Latin America was most likely one of the most affected regions in Latin America by the pandemic of COVID-19. We witnessed that last year because practically all the countries in the region went through a recession, and we had to adjust to something absolutely atypical, for which there were no theoretical manuals to rest on. And therefore, we had to contemplate different interventions, first of all, in the health sector, in health protection, and the protection we had to give the most vulnerable, and to protect the employment. And having said this, at least in the case of Colombia, last year, with the measures that we adopted to face the COVID situation, we managed to double the number of ICU units in the country. We went from 1,300 to more than 13,000. Furthermore, we set up a network of social protection that allowed us to increase the non-conditional transfers and send allowances to those who were receiving conditional benefits. And therefore, that now there are 9 million households that are receiving help from the government. And since these programs of economic transfers for most vulnerable families have been created, 50% of the transfers were made under our government and in these past 2 years. This allowed us to extend a social protection network, and that has allowed to increase demand and to recover pre-pandemic levels of consumption and alleviate poverty. But all of this was done thanks to an initiative that we launched, which is a commitment that we made in our country. And thanks to this intervention, with an investment of more than $40 billion, public and private, and in short-term and medium-term, what we can say is that the economy not only recovered, but it increased far more than the expectations of economies. And the second quarter this year was the highest growth quarter we've had in the last 50 years. And maybe I would also like to stress something that's very important. So far, the growth rate we've been registering this year is above 10%. And OECD is already talking about a projected growth of 9.5%, which is our best growth rate in this century and shows that we are truly recovering, because since 1999, the growth rate was minus 4%, and the year after 2.5%. And now we're going to be above 9.5% of growth rate. And this is very important. And not only this year's projections, but for 2022, the projected growth is above 5.5% and returning to levels of growth equivalent to 2019 as of 2023. And why is all of this so important? Because OECD has moved forward a very important fiscal reform, and it's a consensual reform. And this is going to allow us to increase by 1.8% the GDP. And we're the country that has carried out the deepest reform in this past year. And it is a state policy now, the reform that we have carried out in the education policy. We're covering more than almost 100% of the registrations. And we are incentivizing the employment of young people between 18 and 28%, which also means that they will be getting Social Security. And all of this is because the prospects are extremely favorable. And this is also shown by the OECD analysis. But it also has to do with the multilateral issues. It is urgent, no doubt, that we understand the future challenges for developing countries. This at a time when the interest rates are growing, there will be a lot of competition for resources, but more so because many of the emerging countries haven't carried out the fiscal reforms to be able to face the cost of the pandemic. So since there is a competition for resources, it could happen that the emerging countries lose access and are no longer competitive. And that is why we need to be aware of this, and the IMF has to take note of this. Furthermore, we have to accompany the expenditure and priority expenditure, education, health, etc., and infrastructure. And to do so, we have to find mechanisms to compensate for the debt and relieving the debt for the most vulnerable countries, but also provisional mechanisms that we can take into account climate action and try not to enter in contradiction between the social expenditure resources and those that are devoted to climate action. And what is very important for Latin America is that as it has showed its resilience because it was able to find the innovating public policy to be able to face the situation of COVID-19. But the challenge we have today is to try and find mechanisms that can boost employment and investment. This is a major challenge for us. And what I can say today is that Colombia is one of the fastest growing economies in OECD in the world and in the regional level because we took measures before the pandemic and during the pandemic that have supported and helped the growth in our countries. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, President Duque. We have analyzed what Latin American countries and Caribbean countries have done, but I would like to highlight the great efforts made by Colombia and that we have documented in this report, in the SLEO report, and as well as what ECLAC has done in the social panorama and in its first report, because there is going to be extraordinary growth in 2021 in Latin America, almost 6%. And Colombia is one of the outliers, but since it has a double-digit growth now. But how can we sustain this growth? And how can we rely on international support by accessing markets? And there was a very important initiative, the Global Gateway, that has been launched by the European Union and others. And I think it's going to be extremely relevant as well for our region. Thank you very much for your insight, President Ivan Duque. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. And these are major challenges. The service of the debt is a challenge, and what we have to do if we don't carry out a fiscal reform and how to fund education and health, because we could risk losing a generation, and more integration, obviously. So we do represent a country that walks together. Thank you very much. And now I would like to give the floor to our dear Guillermo Lasso, who is President of the Republic of Ecuador. It's a great pleasure to have you with us, President Lasso. You have the floor. Thank you very much, dear Alicia. And a special greeting to my dear friend, Ivan Duque Marquez, who is President of the Republic of Colombia. Greetings remotely to the President of the Republic of Costa Rica through its Chancellor, and greetings to you, Alicia, as Executive Secretary of ECLAC, and also hello to Sergio Díaz Granados, who is Executive President of the Bank of Development of Latin America, CAF, and greetings to Mr. Matthias Cormann, Secretary General of OECD. Distinguished authorities and dear friends, the crisis of COVID represents an unprecedented challenge to achieve inclusive and sustainable development.
Over the year 2020, all governments had to establish different levels of states of emergency or states of exception and had to enact restrictions on their population's mobility, as all of these were measures to prevent the outbreak and an increase of the number of casualties due to COVID infections. These emergency measures, combined with the biosafety protocols, the restrictions on logistics and the distribution of goods, and the shutting down of international borders, entailed serious drops in the international trade flows, as well as in our capacity to attract foreign direct investment and tourism. And all of this had repercussions and caused a recession for most of the world's economies. The ECLAC report, called The Effects of COVID-19 on International Trade and Logistics, points out that the measures taken due to this health crisis caused a serious weakening of global trade over the first quarter of the year 2020. The World Trade Organization has registered for the first semester of 2020 a 19% drop in global trade compared to the same period in 2019. China, which accounts for approximately 20% of global foreign trade, significantly decreased its output, which had a direct impact on its exports. Now, the trade from Europe, from America, and from the rest of the world also suffered a decline due to the closing of international borders. In this sense, South American businesses, and most of these businesses are small and medium-sized enterprises, had to decrease their output, and some of them even had to stop exporting. Last but not least, according to the UNCTAD 2020 World Investment Report, during the first quarter of 2020, there was a decrease of the international flows of foreign direct investment by approximately 40%. This landscape, which I have sketched out very briefly just now, has had far-reaching implications on the new global configuration that we are currently witnessing. The capacity to react by enacting public policies has been limited for a large number of nations. This is a serious challenge for Ecuador, for instance, because of the prior weaknesses our country already had, as well as the impact this crisis has had on public accounts, because this crisis has entailed one of the biggest downturns of our economy, with a significant drop in GDP and an erosion of public accounts, which have also led to very little fiscal space to finance our recovery and response. According to Ecuador Central Bank estimates, between March and December 2020, our economy declined by 6.44%, and full-time employment fell by 6.91% compared to 2019. This actually represents 532,359 jobs that were lost. By December 2020, the amount of losses due to this health crisis reached the amount of $16,381,000,000. 66% of these losses were registered in the productive sector, 24% were registered in the social sector, and 8%, actually almost 9%, in infrastructure. Within the social sector, the health subsector was hit hardest, with a an almost $3 billion loss. In the face of this scenario, Ecuador adopted economic policies directed at protecting our country's productive capacity and preventing the destruction of our businesses, and especially our SMEs and micro SMEs. Likewise, we have suggested and set forth different measures thanks to our law on economic development and fiscal sustainability, which was drafted with input from different social and political players and which complies with the principles of progressivity and tax justice. Thanks to this plan, 96.6% of our economically active population will not be impacted because most of the effort will be borne by the wealthiest sectors in our country. In addition to this, I will be presenting before the National Assembly a bill to encourage investment, which will streamline all of our legal framework. In addition to this, we will be establishing free zones with tax incentives for agribusiness, logistics, tourism, health businesses, agro-environmental businesses, and others to make Ecuador a country of opportunities, as this is already happening currently. In this sense, I am very pleased to announce that a proper management of this time of crisis has allowed us to achieve this year a 1.5% inflation rate, which is the second lowest rate in the Andean region and the lowest rate among the continent's dollarized economies. I would also like to stress that in November this year, we registered the highest level of international reserves in Ecuador's history, and this is the outcome of 3 achievements that were accomplished by the public and private sectors. First of all, the government's proactive trade policy, complemented by our productive sector's effort and an increase in oil prices, which meant that our exports grew by 30% and we achieved a trade surplus of over $1.9 billion by September this year. Second, we signed an agreement with the International Monetary Fund, and this contributed to achieving credits granted in excellent conditions by multilateral organizations. And third, the transparent and responsible management of our international reserve by the central bank, governed by the principles of safety and liquidity, have meant that we have been able to preserve this at an optimal level, which is consolidating our dollarization and bolstering the foreign depositors' and investors' confidence and trust in the Ecuadorian economy. Along the same line, I'd like to highlight that despite the far-reaching impact of the pandemic on our economy, the Ecuadorian industry has demonstrated its high capacity to adapt and to display resilience. I'd like to especially mention our export companies' capacity to reinvent their activity and have stepped up their adaptation to the current trends of global trade. Currently, our businesses, as is the case for businesses around the world, do their business thanks to information technologies. They perform their online sales on safe platforms and have shown the creativity that they need to adjust to today's times. In addition to this, to comply with the standards and protocols set up by many countries to prevent the spread of COVID, they have had to adapt to this as well. This is one of the elements that strengthens our confidence and confirms our vision of our need and commitment to work on enhancing our country's global competitiveness. My government has focused on having a recovery process led by a successful vaccination campaign, which is encouraging for trade and investment flows and has a direct impact on our population's levels of employment and well-being. This process entailed the biggest logistical endeavor Ecuador has ever had to inoculate 9 million citizens within the first 100 days in office of my government. And we did this thanks to the support of almost all the sectors and entities within our country, whether public or private. By November 30th, 11,335,166 Ecuadorian citizens have received 2 doses of vaccines, which represents over 70% of our population, aged 5 and above. We also have a stock of available vaccines, which means that by December 31st, we will have immunized 85% of our target population. This effort has already had a positive echo in the consumer and business trust indicators, especially regarding trade and industry, where there has been a significant rebound of activity, especially if one focuses on household consumption and private investment. Indeed, Ecuador is a leader in the few Latin American countries who over the last 3 months have successfully improved their business climates. And I'd like to mention here that we had an investors summit. It was held in Quito, and we gathered over 2,000 foreign investors. According to the Business Climate Indicator, which is measured every 3 months and based on Latin American experts' analyses, Ecuador has the highest increase among the 10 Latin American countries, and only half of these Latin American countries had a positive score. In this speech, dear friends, I have tried to introduce you to our new Ecuador, the Ecuador of new encounters, el Ecuador del encuentro. And as what is happening at the domestic level, the international community will find with my country and my government an available, willing, and trustworthy partner committed to democratic and values of freedom that must prevail in international affairs. We have left decades of dogmatism and isolationism behind us. We firmly believe that only by working together, by achieving international cooperation and pragmatic multilateralism, will allow our countries to overcome this crisis. In this sense, and to complement this vision, I firmly believe that as governments, it is up to us to initiate and direct our management towards facilitating trade and investment relations because of their positive impact on millions of people. We keep hearing over and over again that we will be facing a new world after the pandemic, and so many economic, social, and health indicators will prove this right. We have the power to collaborate in our hands so that we can achieve a more inclusive society, a more solidarity-based society, which will increase individual responsibility with a positive outcome on our collective behaviors. We are willing to contribute to building a post-COVID world with a constructive and deeply realistic viewpoint by upholding the principles of international affairs and our best traditions. We are very concerned that a reality that seems to be lurking behind the scenes, which would be marked by further imbalances in the structure of international relations and could lead to the temptation of authoritarianism or totalitarianism, or populism, which is just as authoritarian and demagogic, and which means the violation of human rights. To prevent this, we need to lead by example, defending democracy, and continue to participate in the necessary foreign organizations, especially in our region. At the same time, we need to support all endeavors to successfully preserve the environment. On the issue of the environment, I'm very pleased to tell you that Ecuador has just increased the Galapagos Island Marine Reserve by 60,000 square kilometers, which is added to the reserve that we already had and means that we have almost 200,000 square kilometers of marine reserve. Thanks to these concrete actions, and many others, we can demonstrate our commitment to the environment. Dear friends, currently, all nations are redefining their priorities because we have witnessed the fragilities of our current system. Let us all work to ensure that human beings, with a full exercise of their fundamental freedoms, can be placed at the center of this. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you very much, President Lasso. You have pointed out very relevant points, and I would like to stress that we're really grateful for your intervention. And you mentioned something absolutely indispensable, which is investment. There's a very low level of investment, 17.6% on the average of the GDP. And the world average is 26.9%. And in the emerging countries, over 36%. And we have to increase by at least 9 points of percentage to reach the level of investment needed. And you said that one of the important factors is to set a reliable and trustworthy business climate. And I think that what was presented yesterday in the European Commission, we have the Ambassador Skoff here with us. They're announcing 300 billion euros investment to be able to make progress with infrastructures, and we can't miss out on this opportunity. The second very important issue that you mentioned was the progress made in vaccination. Ecuador, well, all of our countries actually have made great efforts. We're above the 50% of vaccinated people. And obviously there are a lot of asymmetries domestically, but Colombia is above 50%, Costa Rica over 62%, Ecuador over 50%. These are very important figures because it is quite likely that we reach the objective of 70% of vaccinated people. In some countries, it hasn't been possible, but that is why we mentioned the self-sufficiency health plan that has been adopted in this report to be able to be more self-sufficient in medical equipment and health equipment in general. I'm extremely pleased to greet and wish a very warm welcome to the President of Costa Rica, Mr. Carlos Alvarado Quesada, who has played a major role as President of ECLAC in the past 2 years. And we're extremely happy to be with your Ambassador, Rodrigo Carazo, as well. And I would like to give you the floor with my warm affection, Mr. President Alvarado. Thank you very much, dear Alicia. I would like to greet you with equal affection and thank you to these 2 years of presidency of ECLAC in accompanying your work. But we're very grateful to the whole region. And we would also like to greet President Ivan Duque of Colombia and President Lasso of Ecuador. And I'm extremely proud because I know the major progress that has been made by both countries in protection of their populations and vaccination of their population. And as a Latin American, I am extremely proud of this and that we're working together with President Lasso in the protection of our oceans. This is a great announcement that we made in Glasgow, and I was very proud to be a Latin American and to share with President Lasso and with Ivan what we did at the COP meeting, the protection of oceans, and because this was one of the major announcements made, proving that Latin America can be at the cutting edge and we can act as leaders. We don't have to be left behind and in the backdrop and always having to catch up what other countries are doing in policies. And this leads me to discuss this Leo the Latin American economic outlook and the work that is done in OECD in conjunction with ECLAC. I would like to discuss two dimensions. Some are visible and at our reach, and they have to do with levels of vaccinations, levels of recovery that we're witnessing, impacts on disequality, on unemployment. And I think that we have to stress that Latin America has been one of the most affected by COVID, both in relative and absolute terms. And we can't lose sight of this. Of the 5 indicators that are discussed, I would like to stress what the report tells us, and that is not that obvious, but it's something that's underlying the whole report. In Latin America, if we don't choose a certain path, we're bound to come up against a lot of social discontent. There's a lot of inequalities, at the territorial level, at connectivity between formal employment and informal employment, the differences in studies, in education, and different studies show us that the people who are best skilled are the ones who face the pandemic in the best situation. And this is very basic. We're talking about the household basket. And so there is something very strong here. It has to do with not only with economy, but democracy and the social reality in the country. I think that a lot of things are related to multilateral topics. It is true that to be able to face a lot of these issues, we're talking about reaching the objectives of Agenda 2030, or decarbonation, fighting climate change, protecting our the islands in the Caribbean, because their country could disappear because of the rise in the ocean level. We have a shared responsibility to call on other actors to finance us, as Alicia has mentioned. These other actors have a responsibility to support the development of our region and the funding of this development. Why is it their responsibility? Pandemic has showed clearly that unless everybody is in good health, none of us will be in good health. And the Omicron variant, is something that is a good reminder of it. Somebody was telling me recently that there are 2 ways of being selfish. There's the intelligent way of being selfish and the unintelligent way of being selfish. The smart way of being selfish is protect myself, and I'm going to make sure that vaccines reach every country in the world. That's the smartest way of being selfish, to protect myself and my family, to make sure that the whole of the planet is vaccinated. And the unintelligent way and the foolish way of being selfish is to keep the vaccines for ourselves, make sure that we are safe, but as long as other people aren't safe and other countries aren't safe, we will get nowhere. And that's true with development financing. If we keep for ourselves the funding of development, we can have the sense that these resources are going to benefit our own people. But then there's going to be migration, organized crime, inequality, political instability, and this is going to affect economy, trade, and generally the aggregate output of the whole region. So on the multilateral level and the multilateral dimension, we have to call upon others to join in financing. I don't think it's right to say that because our region is relatively an intermediate development region or developed region, that we have to be in charge ourselves of all of this funding. And the other topic has to do with an internal issue. And I think that Leo mentions it and tackles it very well with a kind of ambiguous sentence that has to do with a new social contract. It's a new, talking about a new social contract in our context and given our political agenda is something that is going to be very tricky and complicated. But it is absolutely essential. We need minimum contracts with regard to policy and the role of government and what our people expects from government to be able to meet the minimum expectations and face this instability, this discontent, not only the visible indicators, but the underlying indicators that our region rests on. And what that means is that we have to provide basic opportunities and that we can have a level playing field and that we can meet an ideal which is very Latin American, that the wealthiest and the poorest person can aspire to exploit the potential of their own life fully. And we feel that the government does have a role to play in that. Some people think that the state acts as an arbiter in a fight, and it acts as a moderator. I think that the state, the government, has the role of providing opportunities for everybody to be able to make progress, to advance. And I think that that action of government is at the basis of the social contract. It means that we have to have the right fiscal policy. We have less and less fiscal space. We have more pressure. We're badly rated by the rating agencies, and at least they say clearly what the risks are. They mistreated us, although we are acting responsibly. And in that context, because of the lack of fiscal space, the multilateral action is very important, but also the national action, this social contract, is very important because we need an internal cohesion as countries. This is a difficult context, not easy at all, but as the ex-president of Costa Rica, Pepe Figueres, since we've celebrated 73 years of disappearance of the army. And he had property in the country, and it was an endless fight. That was its name. And that's because life is an endless fight, because when somebody doesn't have nothing to fight for, it has to find some reason to fight, because life is an endless fight. And we're in a region that has to make progress in a difficult time. But the times of crisis are those that generate good character in men and women so they can overcome. And it's on us to respond to the situation. But I'm extremely happy to hear what Ecuador and Colombia has done just to face the situations, because this shows that we do have the capacity to do so. But we have to go beyond. So greetings again to Elisa President Lasso and President Duque and all the participants.
Thank you very much, President. It was such a pleasure and such a pride to hear all three of you, because all of you suggested the issue of the social contract, and that's something that we address in this report. The social contract is this overall agreement. It's intangible, it's implicit, but it brings society together, and it fits in within a whole framework of standards and practices that are formal and informal, but above and beyond all need to provide trust to citizens. And currently, citizens are feeling like they aren't protected. And this response you're providing as leaders of countries in our region by vaccinating, by providing primary health care, by going back to the basics is fundamental. So thank you very much, President Carlos Alvarado. Your leadership in ECLAC is fundamental. Tomorrow we'll be launching a report you requested on innovative financing, and I'd like to invite all of you who are with us to come tomorrow, because our region will not be able to overcome this if we do not achieve access to concessional financing that doesn't just treat us as middle-income countries, because that means we won't access this funding. We need to do our homework, as Presidents Duque and Lasso have said, and that means establishing the appropriate fiscal policies and mobilizing national and domestic resources. But we do need the international community to meet us halfway. Dear friends, let me give Presidents Quesada, Duque, and Lasso a last comment before we conclude this high-level presidential dialogue. President Duque, Alicia, thank you very much, and I'd really like to greet once again President Quesada of Costa Rica and President Lasso of Ecuador. I believe that was a very fruitful presidential dialogue. There are three key messages here. First of all, massive vaccination means solid recovery. Those are our guidelines for growth in our countries this year and next year. Second, financing tools are fundamental. What we need to do now is proactively and swiftly focus on getting an increase in the funds in the multilateral organizations that are crucial for financing in our region. We have been very enthusiastic when it comes to capitalizing the Inter-American Development Bank and to the provision of funds for CAF. But we're going to have to do this with other regional organizations and many other financial tools. We need them to have a very high credit potential. And third, I think that the credits from the International Fund have to move to a new phase. What we've achieved was fundamental, but we need to keep pushing. And the other presidents have said this too. Our biggest challenge today is how can we achieve a genuinely multilateral response to this post-COVID-19 situation. The case of Africa is eloquent in this regard. In Africa, we are witnessing highly complex variants, but it might be the continent that is lagging furthest behind when it comes to vaccination. And currently, the multilateral system needs to learn the lesson. No one will save him or herself on their own, and we need a widespread and massive vaccination campaign. And what Carlos said is fundamental, and that's my last message. Economic recovery is key, for sure, but social recovery, which goes hand in hand with the economic recovery, will mean we have to broaden and keep many of the programs we launched under the pandemic running so that we can keep helping our more vulnerable households and families. This will help aggregate demand. It will help close social gaps. And last but not least, and I must stress this, it helps us make sure that our most vulnerable population has time to adapt to a constantly changing and highly complex situation. That is what I am walking away with, Alicia. But there's something else that's fundamental for ECLAC. We need to go towards a zero net society. And this means that we need to be highly creative and innovative when it comes to green financing for all of our region. Thank you very much. Those are fundamental messages, President. Thank you so much. 4 takeaways for this panel from you. Thank you so much. And I'd like to move on to listen to President Lasso now, please. Thank you, Alicia. I think that we have heard fundamental insights during this forum. I agree, vaccination is fundamental. On December 1st, which was yesterday, we started a massive booster shot campaign for this vaccination. And on Monday, a law for fiscal strengthening entered into force. And this will provide the government with 1.5% GDP equivalent in funds, which will provide fiscal sustainability and strengthen our relationship with the international financial institutions. When it comes to social programs, beyond the shadow of a doubt, this is something that we need to continue to do and to focus on once that we have robust economic and financial tools. And one of the fundamental programs that our government has initiated is combating child chronic malnutrition. And this is one of the most worrisome indicators for our society. And we are also setting forth special causes such as combating violence against women, which is something that worsened seriously during the pandemic, meaning that we need to focus on the economy for sure, but we also need to make sure that we're focusing on defending and upholding social causes that will improve the living standards of our citizens. I agree with the need to shore up our financing funds, and I can sense some threats on the international financing market due to the increase in interest rates. And concretely in Ecuador, it has to do with our concern when it comes to international oil prices. But I believe that altogether we can rise up to the challenge of this crisis, and Ecuador will always be willing and available for international cooperation so that we can achieve good outcomes. Last but not least, I'd just like to say that in our situation, post-pandemic, we have had to face issues such as a lack of citizen safety and security because of the combat we currently have against international drug trafficking and many other ills that we have been victim of over the last 14 years. There has been a major lack of willingness to grapple with these serious challenges that we are currently facing. And I'd like to say this publicly now. I would like to sincerely thank President Ivan Duque of Colombia for his decision to support Ecuador in combating citizens' insecurity. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your fundamental and complementary reflections, for focusing on women. I think that this is a fundamental issue. Thank you for mentioning, and financial issues and the risks, inflation, supply chains. These are issues that we are currently witnessing. President Alvarado, would you like to conclude with a quick comment? Thank you once again, Alicia. Well, the luck of going last after Ivan and Guillermo is that they have already addressed many of the substantive issues here. So I'll try to add to that and not repeat what my colleagues have already said. I think that there's a fundamental issue, and it is that the new social contract we need has to do with inequalities. We need to cut back on inequality in our region, which is one of the most unequal regions in the world, and it has to do with so many of the tensions and frictions in our society's cohesion, which is under strain. And I can say so by giving our example. Costa Rica has become a more unequal society. Instead of bridging that gap, it's been broadening. And the social contract issue has to do with this issue of inequality. And just a footnote, it's not that we are all equal. To the contrary, it has to do with celebrating diversity. But where we need equality is when it comes to equal opportunities. So this isn't egalitarianism. It means having equal opportunities for each and every one of us. And where there are no opportunities, there is no genuine freedom. So that's my first conclusion. This new social contract fundamentally has to do with inequality. The second issue is development. There's a firmly held belief, and that is that the path towards development has already been sketched out. And usually people think that developing countries need to follow in the steps of developed countries. But I believe that we need to clarify this path that has been taken by developed countries is a path that destroys the planet. This path of industrialization or economic growth, as it was performed by developed countries, is a polluting path and it destroys our planet. Now that we have so much knowledge, we need to make sure that Latin America's development and growth is a growth that is fully aligned with the Paris Agreement, with decarbonization. And we need to do that now. We need to make sure our growth is aligned with a green and blue growth, with a growth that is aligned on the SDGs and not a polluting and destructive growth. And this is a huge challenge, and it has to do with innovating and with experimenting with new visions of growth and well-being. And this is one of the biggest challenges our region has today. And we'll need to rise up to it if we are to be successful. And third, and I think this is a recurring issue, but it's fundamental, and it has to do with financing. As Alicia was saying, tomorrow this report that addresses innovative financing and was requested by our pro tempore presidency is something that we requested, but that we've seen in all of the countries in our region. And I think that too often, as a developing country that is constantly requesting funding, you end up feeling that you're in a beggar's position. But I think that COVID has demonstrated that we are an interdependent world, and until the very last one of us isn't doing well, then none of us will be safe. So investing in development means investing in global well-being, because we are all interconnected. It's a responsibility for us as individuals, but it's also a global responsibility. And that is what we need to set forth. And that is where altruistic solidarity and selfish intelligence intersect. And that is where we need to drive these innovative forms even further. And what we've been working on with ECLAC, with the fund to alleviate the impact of COVID-19, and special drawing rights are useful for our country. And what was announced as a huge achievement with the special drawing rights hasn't had a significant impact on emerging economies or for Latin America. It hasn't had an impact in our countries. So if we want it to have an impact, it has to have an impact on our budget. And we need low interest rates so that we can carry out proper policies, social policies, or public reforms, as Guillermo was saying. And it is in the world's global interest that this happens. It's not a favor we're asking. This is in the world's global interest to make sure that this happens. Or as Ivan was saying, capitalizing development banks. And that's another struggle that we're going to have to turn to. And we have joined President Biden's request when it comes to the Inter-American Development Bank and other banks. But we're not asking for favors. This is a genuine global need. And we are trying to drive this forward, and I'd like to thank all of you once again for this opportunity.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've just concluded an extraordinary panel. We've gone a bit over time, that's true. But when I hear President Duque, President Lasso, and President Alvarado, it's a privilege, it's an honor to have them with us and for them to share their outlook on things and give us their vision. And I think that we're at a turning point of humanity. 3 countries that have committed to climate action. I think that we can say truly that it has been a deluxe panel. And I thank Sonia Pereira, our ambassadors here for Colombia, Rodrigo Carazo for Costa Rica, Olaf Sultan from the European Union, and Christian Espinosa from Ecuador, our colleagues Rosa Balanga, who took part in a very important meeting of the African Union with the Secretary General, precisely because we're facing these global asymmetries that are so deep in funding, in climate action, in vaccination. Honestly, it's just not possible. Thank you very much. And I think that we will move on to the next panel, who will be moderated by Ragalur Elin, and we will be hearing Sergio Diaz Granados, the executive president of the bank that has most invested in the pandemic of in our region. It's the Bank of Excellence. I give the floor to Ragal. And presidents, thank you very much. We send you very warm greetings from New York. Raga, you have the floor.
I want to please allow me to join you in thanking the 3 presidents. I completely agree with you that this was a unique opportunity to listen to their insightful remarks on the policies and the recovery and the challenges that we face ahead. And it was very enlightening to see how their respective countries are dealing with the crisis and the plans of getting out of it. Good morning, everyone joining us from Latin America and the Caribbean, and good afternoon to those of you joining us from Europe today. It's an extreme honor for me to co-author for the co-authoring institutions, of the LEO to have you with us here today for this high-level presidential session. As the director of the OECD Development Centre, I am delighted to be moderating this session on the main messages of the LEO 2021. We have heard the president setting the scene so insightfully for us. So we are here along with our partners and co-authors. And I would like to demonstrate the product that we're going to be discussing. Here's the LEO 2021, the much anticipated that we are going to be discussing here. And it feels great to have the report right here with me in my hands today and be sharing it with you here today. The LEO is more than a flagship publication. It's a platform for dialogue and exchange to identify and promote better policies to improve Latin Americans' well-being. And given the current context, the 2021 edition provides policy recommendations for a strong, inclusive, and sustainable, most of all, recovery in Latin America and the Caribbean. And allow me just to highlight some of the key challenges that the LEO 2021 addresses. And this is something that was, of course, discussed here in the presidential debate before. But some of these key challenges are to improve the social protection mechanisms and increasing social inclusion, fostering regional integration and to strengthen the industrial strategies, the rethinking of the social contract to restore trust and empower citizens at all stages of the policy-making process, and also to promote sustainable and adapted macroeconomic frameworks to finance the recovery. And last but not least, the crucial role of international cooperation to support these policy actions. Additionally, as was also mentioned here, climate change, the digital transformation, and gender are the 3 cross-cutting themes of this recovery agenda. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to the co-authors of the report who will discuss these priorities in more detail. We have with us our dear Alicia Parcena, who has now changed her hats. She is no longer the moderator. Now she is the expert panelist. And she is, of course, the executive director of the UN ECLAC. We also have Sergio Diaz Granados, the new executive president of CAF. And we will hear two pre-recorded messages as well. One from Jutta Urpilainen, the Commissioner for International Partnerships at the European Commission, and from our dear Secretary General here at the OECD, Mr. Matthias Cormann. So Alicia, you're not off the hook yet, although you've been participating. We get you while you're still warmed up. How would you describe the impact of the crisis in the region? Maybe more specifically, could you share your views on the role of the social inclusion and regional integration as key dimensions of the recovery? And we look forward to hearing your comments. The floor is yours, dear Alicia.
Thank you so much, Raga. It's really an honor and a pleasure to join you in this panel, and also to be partners, to be partners in this LEO and in many other things, because really with the Center for Development of the OECD, we have done so many things. And with your arrival, I think we have now a very important role to play in the regional integration and also in the recovery path. So let me just contribute very quickly with two main messages, if I may, very quickly, because we took a lot of time in the first panel, and I apologize for that. And let me then switch to Spanish very quickly. Nuestra región fue de las más golpeadas.
Our country was definitely one of the most affected, and I think that is a very strong point. And I think that the impact mainly affected informal labor. The informal workers were probably the most affected. And I think that today informal work is extremely high, and we're above 58% of informal employment. So obviously the most affected were women and young people, because they're the ones who worked in very precarious working sectors, and especially women, because they had to go back home and carry out tasks of care. And this is another issue that is mentioned in the reform education. We're talking about a lost generation in the report, because 167 million women and girls lost a year of school presence, and the dropout risk is very high, especially for young kids in secondary school, because they won't go back to school. And this is linked with low productivity and poverty. And I must say that poverty in our region was mitigated because of the major efforts carried out by countries to compensate for the households during the confinement period. And there are 200 million people who were affected, but there could have been 230 million, at least 30 million less, thanks to these programs. And now we have 78 million under the poverty line, and we could have had 98 million. And so what we have to do is extract these people from poverty and make sure that we make efforts in distribution, because concentration of wealth has increased during the pandemic period, especially in the most developed countries. And our region lost 11% of wealth, and this loss of wealth is a reality. So what we have to achieve is understand how we can overcome this. And what we have to do are two concrete things. One, and the president's clearly stated it, we have to complete the vaccination campaign with solidarity. There's a lack of solidarity. That is very clear. So we have to make sure and guarantee that our region and the world can access vaccines. Some countries have more than 50% of their population vaccinated, but others are below 30%. So we have to support these countries with joint purchases, as we're doing with these health self-sufficiency program. And this is also mentioned in the report, because we have to make sure that our region understands that we cannot act unilaterally. We have to join our efforts for things as concrete as vaccines, financing. And I would say that in this crisis of the supply chains, which has an impact on inflation, of course, because inflation is not only due to supply, but also to demand, but also to supply. And we have to make sure that the supply reaches our region, and we have to do this through joint efforts. So there's a social problem, there's a productive problem, and the final one is the financing topic. And I'm so happy that Sergio Díaz-Granados is with us, because CAF has played a major role during the pandemic. And tomorrow we will be meeting in the afternoon to be talking about the role of banks. They have played a major role, multilateral banks. But in our region, the regional multilateral banks and sub-regional banks have played a more important role than World Bank. But the World Bank contributed $4 billion, but the CAF more than $10 billion to help countries. And therefore, banks have to act together. Financing, banks, integration, the role of banks, and action to fight climate change. And this is what we have to do together to be able to recover through green and blue investments, sustainable investments in dynamic sectors. Thank you very much for your attention. I would like to thank the ambassadors for their presence here, because it was very important to have your support here in New York. Thank you very much, Raga, for this opportunity, and I will be eager to listen to our colleagues and hear their messages.
Gracias, muchas gracias. These comments were very inspiring and were in harmony with what the president discussed here before, and it was. Particularly, they discussed the financing part, and as you know, our next speaker is an expert on financing. I'm now turning to Sergio Díaz-Granados, and first of all, I would like to congratulate you on your new position. It's a great pleasure to have you on board for this year's Leo. And it's a good opportunity for us to further enforce our excellent linkages, and I look forward to cooperating more with you in the future. As I said, we would like to hear your thoughts and your expertise on the economic impact of the COVID-19 in the LAC area, and also how the digital transformation and the green transition that has been discussed here extensively promote a sustainable recovery in the region, and if you could elaborate a little bit on the role of CAF in this agenda. Mr. Granados, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rega, for the introduction. Let me switch to Spanish. Primero, buenos días y buenas tardes a todos.
Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to greet you today for the launch of the Latin American Economic Outlook 2021. CAF has been part of this for 7 years now and has contributed to these different reports. And this year we also worked with the Inter-American Development Bank and focused on a better recovery, which is absolutely timely. On behalf of CAF, I would like to sincerely thank all of our teams for the excellent work that was done in the midst of a pandemic that still isn't over and done with. And thank you very much to Alicia for the background on the study and for moderating the presidential dialogue. And I'd like to contribute with a few ideas to this launch. 91 days ago, I started as executive director for a 5-year term, and I have traveled to 12 countries since then, 12 of the 19 CAF member countries. And I have seen many of my conversations repeated with analysts, with leaders, with the private sector, and all of this is also reflected in the Latin American economic outlook, meaning that what I have been hearing throughout Latin America has all been reflected in Leo. And that is why reading it was such a pleasure. I've been reading it under embargo. And I really enjoyed reading Leo because it was a very easy to read document, but it was a harrowing read too, because it clearly portrays how deep a scar COVID has brought on our continent. But I'd also like to thank you for Leo, because there are practical recommendations and ideas for the future. And I agree with what the presidents were just saying, because what they were saying is that despite this huge crisis and how hard it's hit Latin America on the social level, on an economic level, and on lives lost, we have the capacity and the resilience to move forward. And I think that is one of the biggest achievements of this year's Leo. And there are two others that have to do with the social contract. Alicia said this. When I started working in the public sector 30 years ago, I knew that we would someday have a major opportunity to use technology and to restore the social fabric and the trust in our region thanks to a new social contract. And I think this Leo has a very powerful message when it comes to development and transition. And I couldn't agree with this more. Now more than ever, we need international cooperation. And I'd like to say that the European Union is a partner in this Leo, and we know that we will need to see more efforts. We need to rise up to these structural challenges, as the Development and Transition chapter says, to turn them into development opportunities. So going back to Riga's question and the information Alicia was just giving us about the huge structural challenges that have been deepened by the pandemic, I'd like to recall that between 2015 and 2020, our poverty increased by 6 percentage points, meaning that when the pandemic hit, our region was weak and our region was facing serious social and economic issues, and we had lost the momentum we had when it came to alleviating poverty and broadening the middle class that we had up until the decade prior to that. And all of this that was present before the pandemic was worsened by the terrible year we had last year because of the pandemic. And now I'm concerned that with this recovery, we might reach a very sluggish growth between 2 and 3%, which in Latin America will mean that we will not be able to meet the SDG goals by 2030. We won't be able to deliver on our climate commitments by 2030 either. So it is fundamental, and I'm getting back to your question, Riga, we need a growth potential that is much more robust, much more fair, and that is anchored in productivity gains. And I'd like to recall, as the study says, that the biggest cause of the gap between our countries and developed countries is the productivity gap. And that is 80% of the difference in the GDP per capita between Latin American economies and developed countries. And this low productivity is something that is cross-cutting in all of the industries in Latin America. And the crisis is making this productivity issue even worse. So what can we do? And I'd like to insist on two inescapable things the region needs to do. And it's in the Leo, but it was also in prior Leos. First of all, the digital transition and climate change. When it comes to the digital transition, I believe that the pandemic made this an obligation for the government, for businesses, for everyone. And we need to keep pushing in this digital transition so that it can further productivity and growth and strengthen our institutions. What CAF is doing now is focusing on infrastructure, on more productive use of infrastructure, and closing the digital divide and consolidating a digital market in the region. To sum it up, CAF's agenda for the digital transition is to support Latin America in the next few years, basically when it comes to digital inclusion, and that means defining it as having digital infrastructure. And we've discussed this with service providers last week. What we need to do is increase the digital infrastructure urgently. There's major digital exclusion currently in Latin America, and the only way for us to make headway is having the appropriate infrastructure the region needs. And parallel to this digital infrastructure, we need to make progress in investing in human capital for digital skills. And we have shadows in Latin America, but we also have so many lights. There are major transformations underway in Latin America, and we need to further and foster these. And the development banks have a huge role to play, and CAF is committed to doing this. But the region needs to see South-South cooperation, as the report says. South-South cooperation and sometimes South-North cooperation has to be the solution to our issues. There's another aspect to this digital transition in addition to skills and infrastructure, and it has to do with how we focus on value chains and productive sectors gain ownership over digital technologies. And CAF wants to focus on the digital economy by focusing on SMEs, on the agriculture and fisheries sectors, and something that is fundamental, and we've started to see this, is mitigating climate change and protecting biodiversity thanks to technology, thanks to digital platforms. And currently, under our digital economy initiatives, we'd like to focus on these three key issues. And there's another issue, digital governments. We need this transformation to happen within governments as well, especially in order to bolster more trust in our institutions, to have more transparent institutions with easier access to information, open data, so that citizens can have a more seamless and open relationship with governments. And that's the first highlight I'd like to stress in Leo and that CAF is committed with, and it has to do with the whole digital transformation agenda for the region. The second message I'd like to stress here has to do with climate change. There's now a universal awareness of that our greenhouse gas emissions cannot go on unchecked, and that is what we take home from Glasgow. And I'd like to repeat what the Costa Rican president said. The pandemic and climate change can only be overcome if we all do this together. We can leave no one behind. We can leave no household, no business, no region, no person behind. We all have to work hard to overcome climate change. And this is a major endeavor to reach carbon neutrality, and especially to get a positive nature balance. Our energy matrix has 43% of emissions. In developed countries, it's 80% of the energy mix. But we have issues elsewhere in Latin America. When it comes to our greenhouse gas emissions and the solutions to that, we need to look elsewhere. And we need to focus on land use issues, because that is where we face a huge challenge. Latin America needs to focus on reforestation, and we need to make use of natural technology. A tree is so much more efficient. We have 800,000 hectares that could be reforested in Latin America, and this is a solution for Latin America and for the world, because there will be no solution to global climate change without Latin America. The solution to climate change today is with climate change. We have 16% of territory, but 50% of biodiversity, and we can change the balance here. The green model that can get us out of this situation is firmly anchored in Latin America. And yesterday I was launching a biodiversity network, meaning cities that have put protecting nature and biodiversity at the center of their urban planning. And we launched this in Barranquilla, because what happened in Glasgow has to manifest on the ground. It has to be present out in the field in Latin America with our local governments, and coordinating all of the institutions to work with local governments in Latin America for a very practical reason, and the UN has said so. Today we have an urban planet, and the second most urbanized region in the world is Latin America. Our population is concentrated in cities today. Many emerging cities that have gained a territory by destroying our natural capital. And yesterday we had mayors from the south of Argentina, from Ushuaia, Tierra del Fuego, to Barranquilla, to Niterói, which is a suburban area of Rio de Janeiro, and many other mayors who all signed a declaration with CAF to redirect their strategies for the next 5 years on protecting nature and especially in cities. And a huge factor to cut back on our greenhouse gas emissions and generating jobs. And Leo says this. Leo actually measures how much formal employment can be gained with the green revolution in Latin America in the next few years for a green recovery in the next few years. And this will mean working on transportation, on renewable energies, on reforestation. And a lot of this has to happen in Latin American and Caribbean cities, which is why we are also making this Leo reflection translate into practical initiatives. And that is what we have been doing to plan the next urban planning forum, to have a clear message of how we are interpreting this idea of achieving carbon neutrality in a positive climate action and how this is manifesting throughout the Latin American territory with their local authorities. And that is the second message I had on the importance of the green transition and what this means for Latin America when it comes to jobs. But last but not least, I'd like to refer to what Alicia, President Alvarado, Duque, and Quesada said about strengthening development's financial institutions and CAF. And this is a conversation we're having within the board at CAF because we need better capabilities to face the rest of the decade and Latin America's needs. In addition to our own funds, we'd like to reach out to private and public partners so that we can achieve our social and environmental responsibility and curb greenhouse gas emissions. We want us to move from 26% of green funding, which is what we had last year, to 40% by 2026, and hopefully more than 50% by 2030. And we will be providing $25 billion from CAF to green funding in the region over the next 5 years. And this is a huge effort. As Leo said, it also means making a proper use of international cooperation and of a development model that means attracting knowledge, synchronizing institution, and having a better deployment on the ground. And that is what CAF is committed to. So I'd like to thank you once again for inviting me to be a part of this team and participating in this report, which is a major contribution for closing this year and moving on towards next year. Greetings to all of you.
Thank you, Sergio, for this insightful intervention and for sharing CAF's ambitious agenda and your insights into the financing situation. And as you pointed out, as highlighted in our joint flagship and emphasized in your comments, we cannot respond properly to the recovery if we don't take into account the two major global trends of digitalization and green transition. We have shadows, but we have a lot of light in Latin America, you said. I think it's an optimistic vision, which frames well the challenges ahead. Thank you so much for your participation. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's turn now to a message from Jutta Urpilainen. She is the Commissioner for International Partnership at the European Commission. And before we listen, I would just like to thank Jutta, along with Alicia and their teams, with whom the OECD Development Centre has worked closely on the LEO and on a wide collaboration agenda for several years now under the European Union Regional Facility that Sergio just mentioned, the Regional Facility for Development and Transition for Latin America and the Caribbean. And now I would like us to listen to the pre-recorded message from Jutta Urpilainen.
Your Excellencies, dear friends and partners, I am honored to participate in the launch of the 2021 Latin America Economic Outlook, working together for a better recovery. The COVID-19 pandemic has transformed societies worldwide. Evidence-based analysis is key to guide recovery efforts. And this is why the evidence in this report is crucial for sustainable recovery in Latin America. The report shows that COVID-19 has acted like an X-ray, exposing and increasing inequalities it has also weakened the social contract. Together, we should defend democratic values, human rights, human dignity, and build resilience. Together, we should work towards the 2030 Agenda, strengthening bridges between our regions as a global model of international cooperation. The report underlines that partnerships are grounded on shared values, and the EU-Latin America partnership places sustainability, resilience, and human development at its core. We know that building forward better is challenging, but now we have an opportunity to accelerate social and environmental progress, building on our common values, culture, like-mindedness on multilateralism, climate action, and human-centric digitalization. The economies of the EU and Latin American are closely linked by a network of trade and association agreements and decades of trade and investment. Tapping in the full potential of agreements through reinforced partnerships will be instrumental to create decent jobs and opportunities and advance recovery in both regions. Looking towards the future, the European Union will be at the side of Latin America and the Caribbean in the fight against inequality, the strengthening of the social contract, the promotion of regional integration, and the consolidation of an inclusive and green sustainable development. Muchas gracias.
A big thank you to Jutta Urpilainen for this kind pre-recorded message that we are very grateful that we had the chance to listen to. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, let us now conclude with a message from Matthias Cormann, the Secretary General of the OECD, who will honor us with his views on the report and highlight the policy priorities for the recovery. Over to you, Matthias.
President Alvarado, President Duque, President Lasso, Executive Secretary Barcena, Commissioner Urpilainen, President Diaz-Granados, distinguished participants. Thank you for joining us for the launch of the 14th edition of the Latin American Economic Outlook, our flagship publication on Latin America and the Caribbean. It was prepared with our long-standing partners, the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, the Development Bank of Latin America, and the European Commission. The Latin American Economic Outlook 2021 comes at a crucial moment. Latin America and the Caribbean has been the region hardest hit by the pandemic in many ways. We estimate that the region's GDP per capita will not return to pre-crisis levels until 2023-24. And workers in the informal sector, women and other groups that already faced multiple vulnerabilities are those worst affected by the crisis. The Latin American Economic Outlook addresses the widespread and overlapping impacts of the COVID-19 crisis and offers practical policy recommendations to support a strong, resilient, and sustainable recovery in Latin America and the Caribbean. Outbreaks of the virus remain the biggest risk. We must continue to pursue an all-out effort to rapidly deliver vaccines to the global population. Countries must also seize the recovery as a unique opportunity to set the region on a new development path. So let me highlight some of the key priorities we see to optimize the strength and the quality of the recovery across the region. First, governments should reform their macroeconomic frameworks, prioritizing fiscal policy. The region entered this crisis with fiscal revenues representing less than 23% of GDP, well below the OECD average of 33.8%. Fiscal policy should strengthen taxation, public spending efficiency, improve tax administration, and better coordinated public debt management. The OECD is also supporting multilateral efforts to address the tax challenges arising from the digitalization of the economy through the historic agreement reached by 137 members of the OECD G20 inclusive framework on base erosion and profit shifting earlier this year. Second, governments should strengthen social protection systems. Across the region, 45% of the population live in households that depend solely on informal employment. Effective social protection measures implemented throughout the crisis should be built on to develop stronger safety nets across the region. Active labour market policies and lifelong learning and retraining measures could help workers develop new skills and help them navigate the changing nature of Latin American labour markets. Third, Latin American and Caribbean countries should take more ambitious policy actions to achieve productive transformation, foster innovation, technological upgrading, skills development, trade integration, and investment in infrastructure. For example, research and development investment as a share of GDP is 6 times lower across the region than in OECD countries overall. Similarly, just 14% of Latin American and Caribbean exports stayed within the region in 2019, and the proportion has been declining steadily since 2014. The long-standing aspiration of deepening regional integration is a key dimension to fostering trade, building resilience, raising productivity, and creating quality jobs. Fourth, how these ambitious reforms are achieved in the region will determine their success. The title of this outlook, Working Together for a Better Recovery, reminds us that improving well-being in the region should be a collective endeavor. Social discontent across Latin America is high and rising, with only 38% of citizens expressing trust in their government in 2020, compared to 45% in 2010. This edition of the Latin American Economic Outlook calls for a new social contract to regain citizens' trust. Only through an open, well-informed and participative dialogue involving government, civil society, and the private sector can countries achieve a broad consensus on reforms. We must continue to strengthen international cooperation with Latin America and the Caribbean to support domestic reforms and to better align national and global recovery actions. This is one of the key messages of the report, in line with the broader work we have been doing as part of the EU Facility on Development in Transition. The Latin American Economic Outlook is a core activity of the OECD LAC regional program, and it provides an important platform for the exchange of knowledge and best practices, particularly in the context of this recovery. The OECD Development Centre has 14 Latin American and Caribbean member countries. 4 of these countries are also members of the OECD, and 3 others have applied to join. This puts us in a unique position to nurture multilateral dialogue, promote partnerships, and strengthen cooperation between the OECD and countries across the region. The challenge ahead of us is enormous, but the OECD stands ready to support Latin America and the Caribbean with this ambitious agenda. Thank you, and best wishes.
Many thanks to Matthias Kormann for his kind words on this good cooperation and on this, as in using his words, the flagship of Latin American Economic Outlook, flagship publication of the OECD. Distinguished panelists and dear colleagues, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you once more for your insightful comments. Before saying goodbye, I would like to share my firm belief that working together, as the report suggests, for an inclusive and sustainable future is today much more relevant than ever. And that is the purpose of the LEO, our flagship publication. And that is thanks to the partnerships that we have with ECLAC, with the European Commission, the CAF, and others, that it has become the platform that it is today to discuss and contribute to the implementation of reforms for better lives in the LAC region. And as my final words, I would just like to say, let's keep up the good work and keep the discussion going. I thank you very much, and I look forward to our continued good cooperation and wish you all a very good remainder of the day. Thank you.
Recording stopped.